What if I told you that a single act of courage, performed by someone society completely overlooks, could transform not just one life, but an entire foundation built on false pretenses? This is the story of Lena Parker, a 28-year-old woman who spent her days in silence, her hands deep in soil, her heart carrying dreams she'd never dared speak aloud. Every morning at dawn, while the world of privilege still slept behind silk curtains, Lena would arrive at the Ross estate with nothing but her worn gardening gloves and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold during her long bus ride. The estate stretched like a kingdom of manicured perfection. Every hedge precisely trimmed, every flower bed a masterpiece of color and symmetry. But Lena saw beyond the surface beauty. She saw the roots that ran deep, the delicate balance that kept everything alive. She understood that true beauty grew from patience, from care that no one else would ever see. Most mornings she worked alone. The other staff members, the housekeepers, the drivers, the security guards, they all had their places inside the mansion or near the main entrances. Lena's domain was the gardens, the greenhouse, the quiet corners where only the birds kept her company. And she preferred it that way. After what had happened to her family 3 years ago, after the bankruptcy that had stripped away not just their money but their standing in the community, Lena had learned to find peace in solitude. Lena hadn't always been a gardener. She'd once been a business student with dreams of running her own environmental consulting firm. But when her father's construction company collapsed under a mountain of debt, taking their family home and her college fund with it, those dreams had withered like plants without water. Her father, ashamed and broken, had retreated into himself. Her mother had taken 3 jobs just to keep them afloat. And Lena had learned that sometimes survival meant accepting whatever work you could find, even if it meant others looked right through you. The Ross estate had been her sanctuary for 2 years now. The pay was modest but steady, and there was something healing about working with living things, about nurturing growth when everything else in her life had felt like decay. She taught herself botany from library books, studied soil composition, from online courses she'd taken with the free internet at the local coffee shop. She knew the Latin names of every plant in these gardens, understood their needs better than she understood her own. The mansion itself was a monument to success, all glass and steel and clean lines that spoke of efficiency and power. Inside, Aidan Ross built his empire. At 35, he was already one of the youngest philanthropists in the city, his foundation channeling millions into causes that mattered. But Lena only knew him as a distant figure, glimpsed occasionally through windows or crossing the courtyard with purposeful strides, always surrounded by assistants and advisors. She'd heard the household staff whisper about him, how he'd built his wealth from nothing, how he worked 18-hour days, how he trusted few people after being betrayed by business partners in his early ventures. They said he was brilliant, but cold, generous with his money, but guarded with his emotions. To Lena, he was simply the man who signed her paychecks, a figure as remote as the skyscrapers she could see glinting in the distance. Then there was Camille Harrison, 29 years old, and everything Lena was not. Where Lena moved quietly through the world, Camille commanded attention. As the public relations director for the Ross Foundation, she orchestrated charity galas, managed media appearances, and stood beside Aidan at every important event. Tall, elegant, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to doubt your place in the world, Camille embodied success in its most polished form. Lena had few interactions with Camille, but each one left her feeling smaller. There was the morning Camille had asked her to move her gardening supplies from the main path because they looked unsightly for the foundation's promotional photos. The afternoon when Camille had commented, within Lena's hearing, that some people just aren't meant for anything beyond manual labor. Each casual dismissal was delivered with a smile so bright it took Lena a moment to realize she'd been cut. But there was one person who saw Lena clearly, Mr. Bennett, the estate's former head gardener, who'd retired the year before she'd started. At 65, he still came by once or twice a week, drawn back by decades of habit and genuine love for the grounds he'd created. He'd taken Lena under his wing from her first day, teaching her not just about plants, but about finding dignity in work that others might overlook. "Every garden tells a story," he told her that first spring, his weathered hands gentle as he showed her how to coax new growth from apparently dead soil. "The question is whether you're just tending someone else's story or learning to grow your own." Mr. Bennett had lost his wife 2 years earlier, and the gardens had become his way of staying connected to her memory. He'd tell Lena stories about how Mary had inspired his most beautiful flower beds, how she'd insisted that every garden needed both sunshine flowers and shade flowers, both sturdy perennials and delicate annuals. "Beauty isn't just about what catches the eye," he'd say. "It's about what sustains life when no one's looking." In the hierarchy of the Ross estate, Lena occupied the bottom rung. The security staff nodded politely but rarely spoke to her. The household staff were friendly enough, but lived in a different world of interior concerns. Even the delivery drivers had more status. They dealt directly with the mansion's inhabitants, while Lena remained relegated to the outdoor spaces, invisible to the real life happening beyond the glass walls. This was her world. Quiet, predictable, safe. She rose before dawn, tended growing things, found satisfaction in work well done, and went home each evening to her small apartment where she'd study plant care techniques and dream of gardens she might create if she ever had the chance. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life. And after the chaos of her family's collapse, stability had seemed like enough. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that a single moment of instinct would thrust her into a world she'd only observed from a distance. She couldn't foresee that her quiet competence and genuine heart would soon be tested in ways that would force her to choose between the safety of invisibility and the risk of being truly seen. The estate stretched around her like a fortress of privilege, its gardens a perfect stage for the drama about to unfold. And Lena, with soil under her fingernails and dreams buried deep as roots, was about to discover that sometimes the most unlikely people are exactly where they need to be when courage calls. The first signs of change came with the approaching Autumn Gala, the Ross Foundation's most important fundraising event. Suddenly, the estate buzzed with activity that had nothing to do with Lena's quiet routines. Camille arrived earlier each day, phone constantly pressed to her ear, coordinating details with caterers, florists, and media contacts. The grounds crew was expanded with temporary workers to ensure every corner looked perfect for event photographers. Lena worked longer hours, not because anyone asked, but because she knew her gardens would be scrutinized like never before. She stayed late to deadhead roses one more time, arrived early to sweep pathways free of fallen leaves. This was her chance to show what careful, patient work could accomplish, even if no one would know her name. But as days passed, she noticed troubling signs. The temporary workers Camille hired were cutting costs in ways that would matter later, using cheap fertilizers that would burn root systems, overwatering delicate plants, trimming shrubs without understanding their growth patterns. When Lena tried pointing out these issues to the crew supervisor, she was dismissed with barely concealed irritation. "Look, sweetheart," the man said, not bothering to look up from his clipboard. "We've been doing this longer than you've been alive. Just stick to your little flower beds and let us handle the real work." The real work was causing real damage. Lena watched helplessly as weeks of careful cultivation were undone by workers who saw only immediate visual impact, not long-term health of living systems. She documented problems in a careful notebook, taking photos of damaged root systems and over-fertilized soil, but had no one to report to. The crew supervisor reported directly to Camille, who was too busy with Gala planning to be bothered with what she called minor gardening details. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, other problems were developing. The Foundation's latest project, a series of community gardens in underserved neighborhoods, was behind schedule and over budget. Lena had overheard Camille on phone calls, her voice sharp with frustration, as she tried managing contractors who seemed more interested in profit than actually creating sustainable growing spaces for families who needed them. From her position, outside glass walls, Lena could see stress building. Aidan's schedule had become even more demanding, his brief appearances in the courtyard marked by tight shoulders, the way assistants hurried to keep pace with his long strides. Board members arrived for increasingly frequent meetings, their voices carrying tension even through closed windows. The community garden project was more than just another initiative. It was Aidan's personal passion, inspired by his own childhood. In public housing, where a small garden plot had been his escape from overcrowded apartments and neighborhood violence, the project's struggles were clearly taking a personal toll. Thursday morning, Lena could no longer stay silent. She'd watched the crew destroy a century-old rose garden, cutting healthy growth for trendy replacements that wouldn't survive winter. The sight moved her to tears. She'd prepared photographs and notes. When she saw Camille directing workers, Lena approached with determination. "Ms. Harrison, I need to speak about issues with garden preparation." Camille looked up with annoyance. "Issues? Everything looks fine, much more sophisticated than before." "That's the problem." Lena opened her notebook. "Those were heritage varieties, chosen for this climate. The replacements won't survive winter, and root damage is affecting surrounding trees." She showed photographs, pointed out stress signs. She explained the difference between visual impact versus sustainability. Camille listened with impatience, cutting her off with a cold laugh. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's be realistic. You're a gardener, not a landscape architect. These decisions are made by professionals. Your job is to water plants and pull weeds, not question choices made by people with actual qualifications." The words hit like blows. She felt her face burn with humiliation, aware that other workers had stopped to listen. "I don't have formal credentials, but I've studied these gardens for 2 years. I know which plants work here. If we could consider modifications..." "Consider?" Camille's eyebrows rose. "You want me to modify a design that cost thousands based on opinions from someone who learned gardening from books? You've forgotten your place." She stepped closer, voice both sweet and cutting. "Let me help you remember. You're here to maintain what others create. You're not here to think or plan or question. You're here to do what you're told. Can you handle that, or do we need someone who understands their role?" The threat was clear. Lena nodded silently, closing her notebook with shaking hands. She walked away with dignity. That evening, Mr. Bennett found her in the greenhouse, staring at her notebook. He settled beside her quietly. "She's not wrong," Lena whispered. "I don't have degrees or certificates. Maybe I am overstepping." Mr. Bennett looked at the tomato seedlings Lena had been nurturing for the community garden project. "You know what Mary used to say? Gardens don't care about diplomas. They care about attention, patience, and love. Those seedlings are thriving because you understand what they need, not because you have a paper saying you're qualified." Despite Mr. Bennett's encouragement, Lena retreated into herself after the confrontation with Camille. She focused on basic duties, keeping her head down and observations to herself, even as she watched garden preparation continue its destructive course. The temporary workers had moved on to other sections, leaving behind a trail of damaged plants and inappropriate installations that made her heart ache. But problems extended far beyond the gardens. The Foundation's community garden project had hit a crisis point that even Camille's spinning couldn't hide. 3 of 5 planned sites had been abandoned due to soil contamination issues that should have been identified before construction began. The remaining 2 sites were using growing systems that looked impressive in photographs, but were completely impractical for families who were supposed to use them. Raised beds too high for elderly gardeners, irrigation systems too complex. For community maintenance, plant varieties chosen for visual appeal rather than nutritional value or local growing conditions. The project was hemorrhaging money and credibility. News outlets that had celebrated the initiative's launch were now running critical pieces about vanity gardening that served photo opportunities better than community needs. Board members were demanding answers. Major donors were threatening to withdraw support, not just from this project but from the Foundation entirely. Lena knew she could help. Her notebooks contained detailed research on soil remediation techniques that could make contaminated sites viable. She'd developed simplified growing systems that could be maintained by community volunteers. Her experimental seedlings in the greenhouse were varieties specifically selected for inexperienced gardeners working in challenging urban conditions. But after her public humiliation, she didn't dare speak up again. The irony was painful. She was surrounded by the very expertise the foundation desperately needed, but the social barriers that kept her in place were more impermeable than the glass walls of the mansion. She watched through windows as meeting after meeting failed to produce solutions, knowing that answers were growing quietly, in soil-stained notebooks just yards away from conference rooms where powerful people wrestled with problems they didn't fully understand. The breaking point came on a Monday morning when Lena arrived to find a news crew setting up in the main courtyard. They were there to film a segment about the community garden project's failures, and Camille was struggling to manage the narrative with increasingly desperate public relations tactics. As she tended seedlings in the greenhouse, she couldn't help but overhear the interview taking place just outside the glass walls. The reporter was asking pointed questions about why a foundation with the Ross Foundation's resources had failed so spectacularly at something as basic as helping people grow food. "But Ms. Harrison," the reporter pressed, "isn't it true that community members tried to warn the foundation about these problems months ago? We have records of emails and phone calls from local gardening groups pointing out issues with soil testing and plant selection that went unanswered." Camille's composure cracked slightly, her smile becoming more forced. "We consulted with top landscape architecture firms and agricultural specialists. Our decisions were based on professional expertise, not amateur opinions from people without relevant credentials." It was in that moment that Lena saw Aidan appear in his office window, drawn by the commotion. He stood there, listening to Camille dismiss the very communities the foundation was supposed to serve, watching as she prioritized professional credentials over practical knowledge. His expression was unreadable, but Lena caught something in his stance, a tension that suggested he was hearing these explanations for the first time. Lena watched Aidan's face throughout this exchange, seeing him process the implications of what he was hearing. This was his foundation, his vision, his reputation being destroyed not by external forces, but by internal blindness. The community garden project had failed, not because communities lacked commitment or capability, but because the foundation had refused to listen to their expertise. That afternoon brought news that transformed concern into crisis. The foundation's largest donor, the Whitmore Trust, was withdrawing its support effective immediately. Their statement was brief but devastating. "We cannot continue to fund initiatives that prioritize appearance over effectiveness, process over results. The Ross Foundation's recent failures suggest a fundamental misalignment with our values of practical community service. The loss of Whitmore Trust support would mean cancellation of 3 major projects, layoff of half the foundation's staff, and virtual certainty that other donors would follow suit. It would also mean the end of Lena's position. The estate's gardens would be the first luxury eliminated when finances tightened." The gala, scheduled for the following Friday, had transformed from celebration to crisis management. Originally planned to showcase the foundation's achievements and attract new supporters, it would now be an attempt to salvage credibility in front of an audience that included skeptical journalists, critical board members, and donors questioning their continued support. Camille was in full damage control mode, scheduling additional media appearances and bringing in crisis communication consultants. But her solutions all focused on messaging and presentation rather than addressing fundamental problems that had created the crisis. She was treating the foundation's failures as public relations challenges rather than operational ones. In the greenhouse, surrounded by thriving examples of what was possible when growing systems were designed for real conditions rather than ideal ones, Lena felt the weight of unutilized potential. Her seedlings represented solutions to every problem the foundation faced, but they might as well have been on another planet for all the good they could do. Mr. Bennett found her there on Thursday evening, the day before the gala, tending plants. That would probably be discarded within the week, when the estate was scaled back to essential functions only. He brought her a cup of tea and settled beside her with patient presence that had become such a comfort. "You know," he said after a while, "Mary used to have a saying about moments like this. She'd say that sometimes life gives you one chance to speak up for what you know is true. One moment when staying safe costs more than taking the risk." Lena looked up from the seedlings she'd been watering, seeing something in Mr. Bennett's eyes that suggested he knew more about the foundations crisis than she'd realized. She also used to say, he continued quietly, that the people who most need to be heard are usually the ones who think they have no right to speak. But knowledge isn't about rights, Lena. It's about responsibility. When you know something that could help, staying silent isn't humility, it's selfishness. As she walked home that evening, Lena carried Mr. Bennett's words with her like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. Tomorrow would bring the Gala, the Foundation's last chance to prove it deserved continued support. And somewhere, in the intersection of crisis and opportunity, between safety and courage, a decision was taking root that would change everything. Friday evening arrived with crisp autumn air that made everything seem sharper. The Ross estate had been transformed into elegant sophistication. String lights wound through trees Lena had nursed through 2 growing seasons, temporary stages, erected on lawns she'd maintained with patient care, catering stations among flower beds that still provided beautiful backdrops despite recent improvements. Lena had worked since dawn, ensuring the gardens looked their best, knowing this might be her last day on grounds she'd come to love. The irony wasn't lost. She was preparing the stage for an event that would likely end her employment, polishing the setting for conversations about projects she could have saved if anyone had been willing to listen. As guests began arriving, Lena retreated to the greenhouse to finish final tasks. Through glass walls, she could see the glittering parade. Donors in designer gowns, board members in tailored suits, journalists with sharp alertness expecting a story. Camille moved among them like a conductor, her smile bright despite the crisis lurking beneath the evening's polished surface. But Lena could see tension in Aidan's shoulders as he greeted guests, his jaw tightening when certain names were mentioned. Brief moments when composure slipped to reveal the weight he carried. This was a man watching his life's work crumble, trying to maintain dignity while everything threatened to collapse. The program began with usual formalities, welcome speeches, donor recognition, presentations carefully avoiding recent failures. Lena listened from the greenhouse, hands busy with seedlings that had become symbols of unused potential. Speakers used words like partnership and community engagement, but their language revealed the same disconnect that created the crisis. They spoke about communities as beneficiaries rather than collaborators. Then came the dreaded moment. The Community Garden Project presentation, originally the evening's centerpiece, had been reduced to a brief apologetic summary emphasizing learning opportunities and adaptive strategies. Camille delivered it with professional polish, but the audience's reception was cool, punctuated by uncomfortable silences and barely concealed skepticism. Questions that followed were pointed and unforgiving. A journalist asked about failure to conduct proper soil testing. A community leader asked why local expertise was dismissed. A major donor wondered aloud whether the foundation had necessary competence to justify continued support. Aidan fielded questions with grace, but Lena could see the toll. Each inquiry reminded of decisions made without consultation, opportunities missed through institutional arrogance, good intentions undermined by poor execution. Disaster struck during this questioning. When a board member asked about remediation plans for contaminated sites, Camille's response revealed the organization's cluelessness. She spoke confidently about advanced bioremediation techniques and innovative soil management solutions, using impressive but meaningless terminology. A soil scientist in the audience challenged her, asking for specifics about which techniques would be used and how community volunteers would maintain them. Camille's response made clear she was repeating consultant reports without understanding. The exchange became increasingly uncomfortable as her confident facade cracked under expert questioning. From the greenhouse, Lena watched this painful exposure with mixed sympathy and frustration. She knew exactly which remediation techniques would work for community settings. She'd been researching and testing them for months. Her notebooks contained detailed protocols for soil improvement, using locally available materials, maintained through simple processes integrated into community gardening activities. The evening's low point came when the scientist requested a demonstration, asking someone to walk him through a proposed remediation site, showing how theoretical solutions would work practically. The deafening silence that followed. No one from the foundation could provide that demonstration because no one understood practical implementation of their own proposed solutions. In that moment of institutional humiliation, Lena felt something shift inside her. She'd been watching from margins as people who didn't understand gardens made decisions about gardening, as those who'd never worked with soil pontificated about soil management, as communities who knew their needs were dismissed by experts knowing only abstract theories. Mr. Bennett's words echoed, "Sometimes life gives you one chance to speak up for what you know is true." She looked around the greenhouse at evidence of what was possible. Healthy plants thriving in conditions similar to failed community sites, soil samples showing remediation experiment results, seedlings bred for specific urban community gardening. Challenges. She had solutions, real ones, growing around her, but speaking up meant stepping out of her assigned role, challenging the hierarchy that kept her safely invisible, risking humiliation on a much larger, more public stage. Every instinct told her to stay quiet, to let others handle problems not officially her responsibility. Yet watching Aidan's face through glass, seeing a man who genuinely cared about helping communities but was trapped by systems preventing him from accessing needed help, she felt something stronger than fear. It was recognition that silence facing solvable problems wasn't safety. It was complicity. The decision felt less like choice than inevitable growth, like a seed waiting underground, finally breaking through to light. Lena's hands trembled as she walked to the greenhouse door. Through glass, she could see the elegantly dressed crowd, hear awkward silence following the soil scientist's unanswered challenge. Every step felt like walking against gravity, but she couldn't stop moving forward. She paused at the threshold, aware of her appearance, work clothes dusty from labor, soil under fingernails. Everything screamed she didn't belong in that gathering of polished professionals, but everything around her whispered she had exactly what they needed. Taking a deep breath, Lena stepped outside and walked toward the crowd. Her movement caught attention, conversations pausing as people noticed the young woman approaching with quiet determination. Camille saw her first, expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Lena, shouldn't you be finishing duties? We can handle things from here." But Lena kept walking, eyes fixed on Aidan. Their eyes met, his filled with surprise and possible hope, hers steady with calm from finally knowing what needs doing. "Excuse me?" Lena said clearly. "I apologize for interrupting, but I believe I can answer the gentleman's question about soil remediation." Absolute silence followed. 100 conversations stopped as every face turned toward her. Lena felt the weight of attention, the mix of curiosity, skepticism, and condescension her appearance provoked. But she also saw Aidan's slight nod, giving permission to continue. The soil scientist stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Martinez. You work with the foundation." "I'm the estate gardener. I've been researching urban soil remediation techniques specifically for community garden applications. I have working examples and documented results that might be helpful." Camille's voice cut sharply. "Lena, this really isn't appropriate. These gentlemen need qualified professionals, not someone who's actually been doing the work they're asking about." Lena interrupted gently. She turned to Dr. Martinez. "The sites you're concerned about have contamination levels that are high but not impossible to address using phytoremediation combined with mycofiltration. I've been testing both approaches." Dr. Martinez's eyebrows rose. Those were sophisticated terms used correctly. "You've been testing phytoremediation? What plants have you been using?" "Sunflowers for heavy metal extraction, Indian mustard for lead, willow for various contaminants. But the key is pairing them with right fungal partners to accelerate the process." Lena's voice grew stronger. "The challenge in community settings isn't just remediation. It's making the process simple enough for volunteers to maintain while productive enough to provide food security during restoration." The conversation revealed Lena's expertise depth. She spoke knowledgeably about soil chemistry, root systems and fungal networks, different remediation timelines. More importantly, she spoke about practical implementation, making complex processes accessible to community volunteers, integrating restoration work with food production. Dr. Martinez found himself nodding as she described techniques he'd read in academic journals, but never seen implemented in real-world community settings. You said you have working examples here on the estate? In the greenhouse, I've been using soil samples from contaminated sites to test different approaches. I can show you. The crowd moved toward the greenhouse. Inside, Lena's work spoke for itself. Rows of experimental plots showed different remediation techniques in various stages. Carefully labeled soil samples documented contamination levels before and after treatment. Most impressively, thriving plants grew in soil that started with contamination levels identical to failed community sites. This is remarkable, Dr. Martinez said, examining her documentation. How long have you been working on this? 2 years. Since I started here, I noticed some estate soil had contamination issues, so I began researching remediation techniques. When the foundation announced the community garden project, I started focusing specifically on approaches that would work. In urban community settings, as more guests crowded into the greenhouse, Lena explained not just technical aspects, but cultural insights shaping her approach. She'd realized successful community gardens needed to honor growing traditions people brought with them, seeds, saved from family gardens in other countries, techniques passed down through generations, crops connecting people to their heritage. The foundation's original plan used raised beds too high for elderly gardeners and plant varieties that didn't reflect community food preferences, she explained to a journalist. But when you design systems accommodating wheelchairs, when you include culturally significant crops alongside standard vegetables, that's when gardens become true community assets. She showed seedlings developed through careful selection, varieties combining high nutritional value with tolerance for challenging growing conditions. Each variety was chosen not just for technical qualities, but for cultural relevance to specific communities. A skeptical board member asked, "This is interesting, but how do we know these techniques would actually work at scale?" Lena nodded respectfully. "That's why I've also been working with 3 community gardens in the city, volunteering weekends to test these approaches in real conditions." She pulled out another notebook filled with photographs and data from off-site locations. Results have been consistently positive, but more importantly, community members have become partners in developing solutions rather than just recipients of services. Among the crowd was Maria Santos, a community organizer who had fought for months to get the foundation to listen to residents' concerns. When Maria saw Lena's work, her reaction was immediate and emotional. "This is exactly what we've been trying to tell them, someone who actually understands what communities need." She described how Lena had been volunteering in her neighborhood, listening to elderly residents wanting to grow traditional medicinal herbs, working with children to create learning gardens, helping families design growing spaces fitting their specific living situations. The foundation kept sending experts who spent an hour in our neighborhood, then designed systems ignoring everything we told them, Maria continued. But Lena spent months with us, learning from us, creating solutions with us instead of for us. Doctor, Martinez turned to Aiden. You need to understand what you have here. This young woman has been doing doctoral-level research while building genuine community partnerships, while developing practical implementation strategies. Aiden stepped forward. Throughout the evening's revelations, he had remained mostly silent, listening with intense focus of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew. Now standing among evidence of work happening under his nose, while his foundation struggled with problems already solved, he faced institutional reckoning. Lena, he said clearly, how long have you been trying to share this work with the foundation? The loaded question hung in air. Lena glanced at pale Camille before answering honestly. I tried several times to discuss issues with garden preparation and the community project. I was told my input wasn't needed, that I should focus on assigned duties rather than questioning decisions made by qualified professionals. Aiden's jaw tightened. He addressed the entire gathering authoritatively. Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you an apology. The Ross Foundation has spent months struggling with problems already solved by someone we employ but failed to hear. We've wasted money on consulting fees for expertise available in-house. We've damaged community relationships while ignoring someone who had already built needed partnerships. Looking directly at Camille, he continued, "We've allowed institutional prejudice to blind us to practical knowledge. We've prioritized credentials over competence, appearance over effectiveness. Tonight has made clear our failures weren't just operational, they were moral. Effective immediately, I'm restructuring the Foundation's approach to community engagement. Lena, I'm offering you the position of Director of Community Garden Development, with full authority to implement the approaches you've developed and build the partnerships you've already established." The offer hung in air like morning light, touching new growth. "I'd be honored to help," Lena said simply, "but I'd want to work as part of a team that includes community representatives as full partners, not just consultants. Real change happens when everyone's expertise is valued equally." What followed was unlike any gala ending in Foundation history. Instead of formal closing remarks, the evening became an impromptu planning session. Community organizers found themselves in serious conversations with board members about redesigning projects. Dr. Martinez began discussing collaborative research opportunities. Journalists expecting to document failure found themselves writing about unexpected innovation and institutional transformation. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Mr. Bennett appeared at the greenhouse door. Seeing him, Lena felt gratitude for his patient guidance, his belief in her when she couldn't believe in herself. "Mary would have loved this," he said quietly, eyes taking in the crowd, learning from and planning with the young woman he'd watched grow into expertise. "She always said the best gardens grow from soil that looks unpromising at first glance." Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that follows storms. The Ross estate looked the same from the outside, the same elegant architecture, the same carefully maintained grounds, the same glass walls that had once seemed to separate. Different worlds. But inside those walls, everything had changed. Lena's first day as Director of Community Garden Development began not in a corner office, but in the same greenhouse where she'd spent 2 years nurturing both plants and solutions. The difference was that now the greenhouse had become a meeting space, a research center, and a symbol of the Foundation's commitment to growing expertise from practical roots rather than importing it from theoretical heights. Her first official meeting was with the Foundation's program staff, most of whom were meeting her for the first time, despite having worked in the same organization for months or years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The person who best understood the Foundation's core mission had been invisible to those charged with implementing it. "I want to be clear about something from the start," Lena told the assembled team, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had impressed so many people at the gala. "I'm not here to replace anyone or to criticize past approaches. I'm here to help us build on what we've learned and to create systems that honor both professional expertise and community knowledge." The restructuring that followed was swift but thoughtful. The Foundation's community engagement model was redesigned to include community representatives as paid consultants rather than unpaid advisors. Project development would begin with listening sessions rather than planning meetings. Success would be measured not just by funds raised or publicity generated, but by community ownership and long-term sustainability. Lena's first week was a whirlwind of site visits, community meetings, and planning sessions. She traveled to the failed garden sites with teams that included both technical experts and community leaders, developing remediation plans that combined scientific rigor with practical wisdom. The difference in reception was immediate and striking. Where Foundation representatives had once been met with polite skepticism, Lena was welcomed as someone who had already proven her commitment to genuine partnership. The contaminated sites that had seemed impossible to salvage became laboratories for innovation. Working with Dr. Martinez and his university team, Lena began implementing large-scale versions of the remediation techniques she'd developed in the greenhouse. But more importantly, community members became partners in the research process, contributing observations and insights that enhanced the scientific work while building local capacity for ongoing site management. The transformation extended beyond technical solutions to fundamental approaches. Where the foundation had once imposed standardized designs on diverse communities, it now facilitated community-driven planning processes that resulted in gardens as varied as the neighborhoods they served. Where it had once emphasized efficiency and uniformity, it now celebrated innovation and local adaptation. Lena's office, when she finally accepted the need for one, was unlike any executive space the foundation had ever seen. Located adjacent to the greenhouse and connected to it by glass doors, it felt more like an extension of the growing spaces than a traditional administrative center. The walls were covered with community photos, soil test results, plant breeding charts, and maps showing the expanding network of successful garden sites throughout the city. But the most significant change was in the foundation's relationship with Aidan himself. The man who had once been a distant figure, glimpsed through windows and known only through policy decisions, became a regular presence in the gardens and community meetings. The crisis had awakened him to the gap between his intentions and their implementation, and he approached the work of closing that gap with the same intensity he'd once brought to building his business empire. "I built this foundation because I believe that business principles could make charitable work more effective," he told Lena during one of their weekly planning meetings. "But I was applying the wrong business principles. I was focused on scaling and efficiency when I should have been focused on listening and adaptation." 3 months after the gala, the foundation held its first community partnership celebration, an event designed not to raise funds, but to showcase the work being done by community gardens throughout the city. Unlike the elegant formality of traditional foundation events, this gathering took place in a converted warehouse, with displays created by community members and food prepared using produce, grown in the very gardens the foundation now supported. Lena moved through the celebration with quiet satisfaction, watching as elderly residents demonstrated traditional preservation techniques, as children explained the science behind soil health, as teenagers who had become garden leaders shared their plans for expanding growing spaces in their neighborhoods. This was what success looked like when it was measured by community ownership rather than institutional recognition. The highlight of the evening came when Maria Santos, the community organizer who had been fighting for months to get the foundation to listen, presented Lena with a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "Director of Growing Dreams." It had been made by her neighbor, an elderly carpenter who had become one of the garden program's most enthusiastic participants. "You didn't just save our gardens," Maria said, as she made the presentation. "You showed us that our knowledge matters, that our experience has value, that partnerships can be real instead of just words in grant applications." But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Lena noticed a familiar figure near the back of the celebration. Camille Harrison stood somewhat apart from the crowd, no longer the polished professional who had once dismissed community concerns, but rather someone who seemed genuinely humbled by what she was witnessing. When their eyes met, Camille approached, with obvious nervousness. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, "not just for how I treated you, but for how my approach undermined everything the foundation was trying to accomplish." Lena listened with the same careful attention she brought to all her work, seeing in Camille's discomfort not vindication, but opportunity for healing. "I think we all learned something from what happened," she replied gently. "The important thing is that we use what we learn to do better going forward." "I've been thinking about that," Camille said, "about doing better. So I've started volunteering with literacy programs in some of the neighborhoods where the gardens are located, trying to learn how to listen instead of just talking." It was a small moment, but one that captured the ripple effects of institutional change. When organizations commit to genuine partnership, when they create space for previously unheard voices, the transformation extends far beyond the immediate participants. The evening ended with something unprecedented in the Foundation's history. A planning session led entirely by community representatives, with Foundation staff taking notes and asking questions rather than presenting proposals. The agenda for the coming year would emerge from community priorities rather than institutional assumptions, with the Foundation serving as a resource and facilitator rather than a director and decision-maker. As the celebration wound down and people began to leave, Lena found herself standing with Aidan and Mr. Bennett in the converted warehouse, surrounded by the evidence of what was possible when expertise was recognized wherever it grew. "You know what strikes me most about all this?" Aidan said, looking around at the displays created by community members. "We spent years trying to figure out how to help communities, when what we needed to learn was how to help communities help themselves." Mr. Bennett nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to see seeds he'd planted finally bearing fruit. "Mary always said that the best gardens teach you more than you teach them. I think the same thing is true about the best partnerships." 1 year after the transformative gala, the Ross Foundation hosted its annual Community Impact Summit in rotating community gardens throughout the city. The final session took place in a 5-acre site that had been the most contaminated location, now flourishing as a community food forest with fruit trees, herb gardens, and learning spaces. Lena addressed an audience including board members, community leaders, researchers, and representatives from other cities learning about their replicable model. Her eyes returned to Mr. Bennett in his lawn chair, beaming with pride. "When I started working in these gardens 3 years ago," Lena began, "I thought my job was to make things grow. I've learned that my real job is to create conditions where communities can grow their own solutions." She described technical innovations emerging from community partnerships, new soil restoration approaches studied in universities, crop varieties developed through traditional knowledge and scientific research, growing systems designed by teenagers that surpassed professional designs. More importantly, she spoke about social innovations. Community gardens had become centers for immigrant orientation, senior mentorship, and youth leadership development. Food-growing projects had evolved into comprehensive community development, addressing social isolation, food security, and environmental education. "The foundation didn't save these communities," Lena said, gesturing to the thriving garden. "These communities saved the foundation. They taught us that expertise comes in many forms, that solutions grow from relationships rather than reports, that real partnership means being willing to be changed by the people you're trying to help." She shared legendary stories. The grandmother whose companion planting methods improved soil health beyond scientific predictions, the teenager whose vertical growing innovations were adopted region-wide, the formerly homeless man whose wild plant knowledge led to low-maintenance food forests in parks. Dr. Martinez spoke about academic papers emerging from community-university collaborations. "In 20 years of soil science research, I've never seen innovations develop as quickly as through these partnerships. Combining scientific methods with community knowledge creates solutions more effective and sustainable than either approach alone." The foundation announced its newest initiative, a mentorship program placing experienced community gardeners in advisory roles with other organizations. Maria Santos, now Director of Peer Learning, would lead the program. "The best teacher I ever had was Lena," Maria told the gathering. "Not because she knew everything about gardens, but because she knew how to learn from communities while contributing her expertise. That's the model we want to share, not top-down assistance, but side-by-side collaborative learning." As the summit concluded, people lingered reluctantly. Children showed visiting adults their favorite spaces. Elderly members shared seeds with researchers. Teenagers demonstrated mobile growing systems to neighbors starting similar projects. May. Day ended with dinner prepared from garden produce, served family-style at reclaimed wood tables, surrounded by plants that provided the meal. As sunset cast golden light through fruit trees, Lena sat between Mr. Bennett and Aidan. "You know what Mary would say about all this?" Mr. Bennett asked, surveying the community celebration. "She'd say this is what gardens are really for. Not just growing food for the body, but growing connections for the soul." Aidan reflected on his transformation. "I spent years thinking more resources meant more impact. I've learned that better relationships means more impact." The foundation's work had expanded meaningfully. Other cities sent delegations to learn their partnership model. Universities revised community engagement curricula. Policy researchers studied the initiative as effective institutional community collaboration. Children who learned to grow food were teaching families about nutrition and environmental stewardship. Seniors sharing traditional knowledge found new purpose. Young adults developing leadership skills through garden management applied them to other community challenges. Lena's role evolved to traveling between communities, facilitating innovation, sharing, supporting new partnerships, and documenting adaptable approaches. She maintained connection to the Ross Estate Greenhouse, now a research center and training facility for regional community garden leaders. The work attracted national attention through speaking engagements, academic papers, and consulting opportunities. Lena accepted selectively, ensuring community partners were co-presenters and revenue supported local work. More personally, the transformation brought unexpected relationships. Her partnership with Aidan evolved into deep friendship, built on shared commitment to learning. Mr. Bennett became the grandfather figure she'd never had. Throughout the city, she found herself part of an extended family of gardeners, organizers, researchers, and dreamers who created something unprecedented. An institutional approach honoring both expertise and community knowledge, measuring success by relationships and results, understanding that the best solutions emerge from authentic partnership rather than imported intervention. The Foundation's annual report included impossible metrics from 2 years earlier. Soil contamination improved beyond projections. Community ownership reached 100%. Youth leadership resulted in scholarships, job placements, and new social enterprises. But the report also included unquantifiable stories, neighbors becoming friends through shared garden work, families improving health through fresh food access, communities developing confidence in problem solving and creating positive change. As winter approached, Lena found herself again in the Ross Estate greenhouse, preparing next year's plantings. Now the space hummed with activity as community leaders, researchers, and foundation staff worked together on collaborative projects, blurring lines between professional and community expertise.